This is the meeting of the almost peppery beards. We're not gray beards yet, but we're all getting there.
Yeah,
I'm working on
COVID,
it.
COVID's done that to me pretty much, I would say.
Oh no.
Yeah, look at videos like from this flood and COVID. So look at videos from like 2019, and it's all brown, and I'm like losing my hair. It's all gray. So yeah.
Sorry.
So it's nice to meet you, James.
Pleased to meet you too.
Yeah, you guys haven't interacted before.
We had some email, but that's it.
Yeah, I think so. Or I think just through Twitter a little bit. But I mean, obviously, I've been following what you've been doing from the beginning, and I think what I really appreciate of your work is that you're one of the few people that criticize what's going on, that has actually read the books and understands, both the let's say the origins of things like CRT and the the Marxist thinkers, like post-war Marxist thinkers, but then also how it feeds into postmodernism. And so your critique is a lot better than let's say, what's his name, Hicks, with his understanding postmodernism, which I don't think he really totally understands postmodernism. So it's been great.
He understands Rousseau very well, though.
Yeah. So it's been good. It's been good to see someone kind of take on what's happening and expose it. But I've been really curious about, let's say, because I propose a solution. I mean, I propose a solution which is, in a certain manner, a narrative solution. It's related to postmodernism to a certain extent, which is that we can't avoid living in stories. We can't avoid living in narratives. And to a certain extent, we also can't avoid living in hierarchies, although I don't see that as necessarily negative. And the question, the solution I propose is a kind of reinterpretation or re-engagement with Christian tradition and kind of diving into that story and seeing it as a backbone that that's going to pull us through as much as possible. But I think in your case, I felt like you understand the problem super well, but I haven't yet gotten a sense of what you think the solution is.
Well, we can talk about that for the lovely audience. Are we talking for the lovely audience?
I don't know. Are we, Benjamin? You know that.
Are we not always?
Are we not or always?
I did want to
this
point
isn't
out.
time for Socratic rhetoric. It's time for answering a simple question. I'm just kidding.
Isn't that what Socratic rhetoric is? But
you're doing it again, Benjamin.
Jonathan, you said specifically Christian tradition, not necessarily Christian theology, but I think there's important. I just want to highlight that you said tradition. That might have more room for more access for more ways of thinking than just like saying Christian theology. I just want to point that out, but I don't know if you.
Yeah, I think it's important because I see it's not just about ideas; it's about embodied practices, and also it's about communal relationships. And I think that's where a lot of the activism is strong, is because it understands that human beings exist through relationships and relationships of power and of identity, which is something that is just inevitable, but they weaponize it to a weird kind of upside down satanic version of it. And I think that if we just go back to just rationalism, we can't. There's no solution, because the way that I live in my family, that I live in my community, is not only through shared memory, shared story, shared ritual, shared practice, and obviously shared belief as well. But that it's not just shared belief, which is why I wouldn't say just Christian theology.
So seriously, are we on the air?
Yeah, well, we're not live, but we are recording.
Okay.
So.
And you don't have to cut that out because I think it's charming. But okay, so I didn't want to just get off on some tangent before we get started. And
yeah, we don't have to. We can do,
because I can't ever say anything great the second time. And so I've been thinking a lot. I don't know what a solution looks like. I do think there needs to be some kind of a culture of renewal. In fact, I think there's got to be a two-pronged approach, which is, in a sense, that we have the house is on fire right now, so we need very practical things done to put the fire out and to rescue who can be rescued from the danger, and then the immediate danger. And then we need to, at that point, start assessing, as if we use the building on fire metaphor, why did the building catch on fire? How can we rebuild the building? How, when we rebuild the building, do we rebuild the building such that it's not so easy to catch on fire again? These are the kinds of questions. And, obviously this is very metaphorical. I'm obviously quite drawn lately, partly because of my spheres of influence in the opposite direction, the spheres in which I am embedded, not in which I have influence, largely running around with Calvinists, meeting a lot with Catholics to hear different Christian perspectives. I'm reading Marxism as a theology, and so I agree that there's something unique in the Judeo-Christian, both theology actually, and the traditions that spring from it, that is necessary. I also believe that you are correct that one of the things that the Marxists have very successfully done is to weaponize the relational nature of human existence. In fact, they try to make it where the relational nature of human existence is the only part of human existence and turn the whole theological construct, which is Christianity turned on its head. It's actually very easy to read. It's an inversion of the story in Genesis. It's an inversion of this story. It's an inversion of that. It's literally just turning the Christian story on its head. But the reason we see this inversion is because we're now favoring pathos, lived experience of lived realities as they're phenomenologically understood through the leftist dialectical frame that's been dominant for 200 years. And therefore, we have this upside down thing. So I think whatever the solution that we're going to have to build out of this is going to look like is going to have to be one that does what Christianity very successfully did, which was to build a set of traditions, community, relations, rituals, everything out of a view that puts the order of the universe, or logos, as the sovereign against which we can't get around. And I know I'm rambling a bit, but I know that this is a big theme because if we read the leftist literature, for example, if we read Kelly Oliver from 1989, who Alan Sokal made famous by quoting her on this, she says that the goal of their theories, so at this point feminist theory in the late 1980s, was to no longer be concerned with truth and false, but rather with strategic operational success. And she says that the goal of that is, and I mean, we can look it up and read the exact quote. She says that we've come to a point where we no longer need to be concerned with true theories and false theories of the world, but with strategic theories that achieve operational goals. And then she says that the chief operational goal is to get around the absolute sovereignty of recalcitrant nature. In other words, to be able to remake the world according to our strategies, instead, which is what Marx called humanizing the world, as opposed to, putting ourselves in a position of humility before what is, and according ourselves with that, which, by the way, Marx said is what animals do, and what makes humans human is that we're change agents, that we can transform the world rather than just react to it and live with it as it is.
Yeah, that's interesting because I noticed you made a tweet recently about the Promethean nature of Marxism and how there's a sense in which there really is this, it's a revolutionary thinking brought to its end, right? But because revolutionary thinking is right there already, I think that's where maybe we probably will disagree, is that I think revolutionary and Promethean thinking is there already in the Enlightenment. And that it increases and it accelerates. And you could say that it devolves to a point where, let's say, something which at first is seen as just the enlightened being reaching up and grabbing something to modify the world with, devolves into ultimately, the trolls coming out of the ground and, just destroying everything and taking over, which are actually images that I pointed to that Marx uses. He uses this really dark imagery of these monsters and of these beings that are almost underground that kind of rise up and take over civilization. It's like Lord of the Rings inverted or something.
Like awakening the Balrog.
He would have cheered for the Balrog and for the orcs and whatnot. And so but I don't know, what do you think about that? That there's something already in Enlightenment thinking, which is this notion that, for example, like even the notion that we're going to be saved through technology, which is something which I think Pinker also seems to be tied to. There's something already Promethean in that gesture. That it's not that we're going to be saved through, let's say, virtue or through being all aligned towards the source of infinite love, but that we're going to be saved through reason. Is, let's say, reason on its own is seen in some ways as the sin of Satan. There are many, even in Paradise Lost, there's this sense in which it's actually the self-sufficiency of reason which leads to the fall, because it's this idea that it's like I can just grab this and put it to use and not realize let's say the monster that I'm unleashing on the world. And so that's the way that seems to be, at least that's the way that I tend to see it. I tend to see the fall, the beginning of the fall coming before, in the Enlightenment already, being there already, Enlightenment, in this type of arrogance that you see in Bacon and that you see in these Enlightenment type figures, thinking that they can master the world, thinking that they can dominate on reality. And then Marx is the opposite. Marx ends up being, well, he continues down the revolution, but now it's constantly lower and lower until it just becomes, basically the dirt trying to take over from the light, or trying to cover the light completely.
Yeah, it's funny, by the way, that you said an inverted, not to distract from the important point, but since you said the inverted Lord of the Rings, I just saw something yesterday that apparently they refer to Zuckerberg in Facebook as the Eye of Sauron, and then he thinks that's a compliment. And so it's like, well, here we are. He's like, no,
it's about power, and it is in the end all about power. And you can see like the worship of power already in the Renaissance with Machiavelli and these types of figures, that you already kind of see this inkling where, like you said, in terms of when you talk about feminist theory as being about how to implement transformations, I mean, what we're talking about is power. And Derrida ultimately came to that himself, talking about forces, saying that there are forces of interpretation, and that these are what are being negotiated. We don't have the sense of truth anymore, but only of force, like different strengths that pull on each side. So it seems like that's ultimately this kind of brute force is what is coming out of Marxism.
Sure, yeah. So I'm actually probably more pro-Enlightenment than you are by a fair measure.
Sure, but that's okay. We can still talk.
Yeah, I'm pretty pro-Enlightenment. And so I do frame the Enlightenment a little bit differently. I understand the Enlightenment a little bit differently, and I can understand kind of what you're pointing at. What I see the Enlightenment, and you do see a certain arrogance, whether it's Bacon or whether it's Newton or something, that's certainly there. And this idea that you can master the world, especially when I look at the way, now, of course, we're looking at the Enlightenment in a variety of domains. There's kind of a scientific Enlightenment, that's kind of an epistemological or knowledge frame, intellectual frame. There's a economic Enlightenment, and that's where, a lot of people, this is a favorite talking point of my friend, you guys probably know Vivek Ramaswamy, but he likes to point out that 1776 was the year of the Declaration of Independence, but it was also the year of wealth of nations. And so we have this kind of economic Enlightenment happening, and we have this political Enlightenment happening at the same time, with kind of the Declaration and this kind of Scottish Enlightenment and the Lockean view of property rights and politics, which, by the way, the property rights were, for Marx, the enshrinement of the division of labor, and the division of labor is what marks the fall, according to Marx, out of the garden, just to kind of bring that in. But I see the Enlightenment in a couple of different ways, one of which is actually by adapting the Marxian frame, and I've spoken with Benjamin about this before. And another is that I see it as having been equipping ourselves with a variety of tools that don't necessarily tell us what our disposition toward those tools are. And so our disposition toward the tools of, say, coming to understand the world can be one of arrogance, that we can come to understand the world in order to master it, or it can be one of more humility, which is that we can come to understand the world in order that we can accord ourselves with it more successfully. And then, interestingly enough, Christianity throws this kind of solution to this problem in, since we've already invoked that, which is that according to Genesis, we're appointed as stewards of the world. Mm-hmm. Right? And so the steward is not the king, going back to Lord of the Rings. It is not the steward's role to order the kingdom as he will. It's to govern in the king's absence. And so obviously the Logos, or Christ, is set up as the king in Christianity and is absent. And in the king's absence, man is the steward of the world. So God is absent from the world in some way. And so we're stewards. But to do responsible stewardship, we have to be in full understanding of the world that we are stewards over, but also we have to be oriented in a disposition of humility, where it's not ours to master. It never was ours to master. It's God's world, It's Christ's kingdom, and it's only ours to try to order as best we can in the comprehension of what is intended in that by that ordering of the world. And so the disposition of humility versus arrogance, you can read the arrogance of somebody like Bacon, and you can get this idea that contained within the Enlightenment is the idea of reaching up and picking the apple for yourself, and thus recreating the fall. But you can also see it rather as using the gifts that we have with intellect, reason, ethical thought, all of these different capacities to better understand the world that we live in and ourselves within it, and thus come up with strategies for that stewardship model, which again, for me, this just boils down to, are we arrogant enough to believe that by one means or another we can make the world the way we want it to be? Or are we largely subject to the world, that there is something bigger and grander than ourselves that we are utterly humiliated before, whether that's God, whether that's just the enormity of the world itself. So many of our things that we attempt, like a great reset, don't go so well, because that arrogance doesn't work out. And so I don't see the Enlightenment necessarily as having a dispositional claim built into it. Certainly in all of those different domains, whether it's the kind of Democratic Republican political sphere, whether it's the economic sphere, where both of those are basically based off of what are property rights and how do we secure them for people, whether it's the intellectual sphere. The second one, or the first one that I mentioned, though, where I see the Enlightenment, this is where I've readapted the Marxian historicist frame. Marx, of course, says that, you have this primordial communism, which would have been good if everybody was in on it together, but everybody was estranged from one another. And then people started to enslave one another, and so you entered into a slave economy system. Then you entered into a rearrangement of this where you had landowners, capital holders, in a sense, in a earlier frame that were aristocrats who ran feudal estates. And the estate economy is what he calls the third stage. And then the fourth stage is capitalism, where, in a sense, everybody is their own small feudal lord, or their own property holder. Everybody has their little bit of property, but in reality, what there is an overarching system whereby the aristocrats kind of stay the aristocrats and they exploit in a different way, and that's capitalism. And then socialism and communism come down the track. And what I perceive, and there's a lot of analysis that suggests that socialism is actually a step backwards to a new aristocracy, where the former losers become the new aristocrats, and then that devolves into slavery eventually, and eventually you're supposed to get communism out of this, where now the entire globe doesn't need a government and we're all working together, kumbaya. And what I see is the information economy that we've existed in is very similar. I don't want to go so far back as to go primordial with it, but we could, where it's kind of a total mystification and order of the world, and nobody questions it, and everybody's happy. And then you kind of move into one that's tantamount to slavery, which is basically the magisterial model, which we would call the pre-modern model. And then what I would say is that the modernism, or modernism not correct, but modernity, that period following the late medieval through roughly the present, the emergence of postmodernism and high technology information age changes that, actually indicates the third stage of information history. So it's lagging one step behind political and economic development. And that, if we're going to adopt the stage model, the historicist staging model of history. And so what we've had is experts, we've had universities, we've had media mouthpieces that work. They're like intellectual property holders, so literally, like Disney right now. How do we break down Disney for being groomers? Well, you take away their copyrights. That's how. And so you remove their ability to hold massive amounts of intellectual property indefinitely. And so you bring that back into the economy of information in a different way. So what's gone on then was what we call the Enlightenment was actually the transition out of the second magisterial phase, where the church declared this is what we're going to do, and you either did it or at some point you're getting burned at the stake, right? And so it's like information slavery. You don't have any options. The masters tell you what you're going to believe, the end. So we have this revolution in thought. We call this the Enlightenment, and it actually entered into an information aristocracy, where institutions like universities and media, et cetera, became the dictators, the new information property holders that tell us how we're going to understand the world. And now I believe that we're actually in a second Enlightenment. and I've argued this at length, I've spoken with Benjamin about this, we're now in a second Enlightenment where the marketplace of ideas, which we have falsely believed existed, it was more like the mercantile or whatever of ideas, the mercantilist market of ideas. Now we're opening into an actual free market of ideas through information technology. And so we're going through the trials and tribulations that come along with entering into a new phase of information history. And in that regard, not only do I not think that I don't think the Enlightenment was like the seed of its own demise. I think it was, just to borrow from the historicist thinking that maybe I shouldn't, that it was an earlier stage in the development of human communication and organization than we thought it was up until this point. And so, of course, it wasn't. It was setting up an aristocracy, but out of a form of slavery. So now we haven't even experienced information freedom yet. We don't even know what it looks like. We haven't even put the boundaries on it. And so when we start talking about solutions, or solutions looking forward, need to look at the question of, okay, we're in 1770. We're reorganizing the entire world. Wealth of Nations has not been written. But here we are looking at the internet the way that Adam Smith was looking at America. Mm-hmm. And saying, what's going on here? What makes this work? We're looking at America the same way that Alexis de Tocqueville was looking at America and saying, what's going on here? And so the information freedom of the internet has opened. It's like the American continent has been partially colonized. Something's going on. Something that works is going on. But there are all these challenges. And obviously the crown, King George is not happy about it. And so that's like Zuckerberg with his Eye of Sauron is like King George in this. And so we're in the, again, to borrow Marxian language, we're in the pre-revolutionary moment where the conditions are becoming ripe for that revolution to spill over into the next phase. And the dying power is grasping. Yeah. Sauron's reaching out his dark shadow of a hand over the land. And is he going to grab it or is he going to miss?
Mm-hmm.
The concept of revolution, Jonathan, you have a definition of it. I hear a different kind of definition of it. So, like, just to get really, really simplistic, there was the French Revolution and the American Revolution. There was two different types of challenges to the powers that be, and one opened up possibility. The other one, I guess, eventually opened up possibility, but had to spill a whole bunch of blood. And Jonathan, sometimes when you talk about revolution, it seems like you stress the negative side of it.
The way that I understand revolution, especially in the modern world, is the notion of something from below grabbing power from something that is above them. Whether or not those the way that it's structured is legitimate or not, it's the people from below taking authority for themselves, you could say, and then taking it down onto them. And I think that if you see it already in the story of the cosmogony of Hesiod, you get that notion that when you do that, it creates a cycle of illegitimacy, and that you're always in trouble when you do that. But if you castrate the father, then you're opening yourself up to get castrated yourself, because your authority came from your father. Your authority comes from your father. So if you kill your father, then your kids are coming for your balls. Like, it's just inevitable that that's going to happen. So it's actually about a structure of reality that authority, let's say authority has a certain way of laying itself out. And if we mess with that, then we create these cycles of revolutions. And the cycles of revolutions appear because one of the problems of illegitimate authority is that it has to become tyrannical by the very means of being illegitimate. And if someone takes power, and then they have to crush those below them, because those below them are now coming for their authority as well. And so, I mean, an interesting way of seeing it, and I don't know, James, if you know a little bit about Vedantic theory of the caste system. It's very politically incorrect to talk about the caste system, but if we understand the basic Varna, like the basic caste system, not the economic caste system, but just the spiritual caste system that exists in India, they have a sense in which the world is structured through spiritual authority, which has no political power, is the highest. And then they have political authority, which takes their power from the spiritual authority. But then they have power in the world. But their power is grounded in those that are above them that don't have physical power. And then below them, you have the mercantile caste, which is protected by it has to serve the interests of the aristocracy to a certain extent, because if it doesn't, then they're going to get clamped down, and also they'll lose their protection because they're not supposed to have weapons themselves. Like, they're not supposed to be knights or to be. And then below that, you have like the servant class, let's say, that is the people. And you also have the peasants and the people and all of that are basically working. And so there's this theory, right, in the Vedantic system, which is that the political class, they get annoyed to having to submit to these spiritual people that are telling them how to live and what their values are and what God says. And so they want to take that for themselves. So they'll do something like create national churches, or they'll submit the spiritual power to their level. But then once they do that, then they have the problem of the gods in Hesiod's cosmogony, which is that if you kill the thing that gives you power, gives you authority, then you become more tyrannical, because you know that now the merchants are going to come for you. Now the merchants are going to want to chop the heads off the aristocrats because you crushed the church. And then once you do that, then here comes the peasants and the workers, because they ultimately thought that all this was grounded in God. And now that they know that it's not, or they believe that it's not, then why would I trust all these people that are above me? And so it's like this devolution of power. And the sense you get is that Marx seems to get it right, but upside down. Like he actually understands the basic structure of that. But it's really the idea that the peasants have to rise up and take. So that's why, in a way, it's Promethean, or not just Promethean, just basically in the Greek cycle of gods, it really is the idea that it starts with the castration of the father. And so that's why I see revolution. And so, for example, like what you described in terms of this information age, so you always have to see it as a dual position, where this revolution that you're talking about has both in it the absolute freedom of this marketplace of ideas and everything, but it also has within it an absolute tyranny, the likes of which we've never seen before. And those two things are almost like they cause each other, because you need let's say information without hierarchy doesn't, first of all, it can't exist. It has to be kind of organized in a hierarchy, because our attention is necessarily hierarchical. And the question is, who's going to manage that? Who's going to tell us what's important, or who's going to help us see what's important, and who's going to weaponize that, like you said? Because once you realize it, before you have information, you have something like attention, something like value, virtue, things that are more important. Then you can weaponize that to your ends, let's say. So I feel like what we're seeing, so it's like I get it that we're on the verge of blockchain and of all these things which feel like they're going to bring about a decentralized network of communicating, people that communicate and share information and knowledge. But you can see, right, like you said, the Eye of Sauron at the same time. So you have to understand, like in the Lord of the Rings, that Sauron controls the orcs. It's like it's about extremes. It's about how the orcs want to be free and to do whatever they want, and then Sauron controls them. And that's it's like I would say it's like punk rock can't exist without absolute systems of control, because without it you wouldn't even have that type of freedom. So this pendulum just swings larger and larger. And so to me, the solution has to be more like right attention, or right. I know that it's not, I'm not an ideologue. Like, I don't think that it's going to happen. Like, I don't think that we're going to all of a sudden see like saints rise up and like, or something like that. I don't think it's going to happen. But I without that, I do see that this revolution that you're talking about is going to lead, the same mechanism that leads to blockchain is going to lead to the centralized digital currency. By the way, it's the same people doing it. Like I was explained by someone recently, one of these Bitcoin gurus, that the people who set up Bitcoin are the same people hired by the government to set up the central digital currency. And so it's like the systems kind of play themselves out.
No, I hear you, and you're right. There is that heaven hell dichotomy, the freedom versus total or new levels, I'll say of freedom versus total tyranny, the likes of which we've never seen in the moment, and of course that is enabled by technology. I would say that of course that this is one of the gifts, since we kind of started with the idea of contextualizing Christianity to the present moment, that Christianity gives. You can't exactly castrate God as Christianity conceives of it, right? And so there is a transcendent sovereign that is identified, again, with logos, with the order and structure of the world, to which he spoke and gave existence according to the Bible, and that authority follows from there. All authority, as if you talk to Christians, they will tell you all authority follows from there. And so this problem of revolution has to follow what Marx says, which is to cast down God before any of that can occur. Mm-hmm. Because it's if you buy the theology, it is impossible to castrate that which is transcendent to this world. It's not in this world to castrate. It's not like you're looking at the Brahmin caste and saying, well, I know who they are. Those are people with addresses. And how convenient that I'm the sword-wielding caste and know exactly how this works. And like, put your dukes up, priest. Let's see what comes next.
Let's see how much you can defend yourself.
Yeah. And so when you hierarchize, I can't say words sometimes. Up against something that's a transcendence as the source of all authority, and then you say that thing is the logos, which is this ordering principle, and then we get very Jordan Peterson-ish and say, well, that means is, can you do the job? Kind of a very Christian pragmatist sort of view. Can you do it? That, in other words, merit becomes a basis, like a worldly reflection. I don't do so much with Vedantic thought, but I do a lot more with Taoist thought. So you have your pre-heaven and post-heaven formulations. You know, heaven is the sun, and then fire is the worldly representation thereof. And so you have your pre-heaven and worldly interpretations of things. So here, merit and character become kind of your guideposts to tell you kind of what the authentic, or what the authoritative hierarchy looks like. Then, you know, you have a system that's not quite this is what what Benjamin was saying a second ago about, you have a revolutionary system that's not quite the same thing. It's not just people from below seizing power from those above. It's people trying to, in fact, decentralize. So decentralize those kinds of decisions. It's not going to be King George who's going to order my life anymore. I'm going to order my life. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to create a republic, if we can keep it, madam. And we're going to create a republic in which we've now devised a system of government through the thought of the Scottish Enlightenment with divided power. So it's a form of decentralization, And so what it comes down to, for me then, when we have this choice between this total calamity, possibly, or total slavery, versus this kind of new horizon of human freedom, I almost go to Foucault, to the degree that Michel Foucault was right about things. Or now we get into our postmodernism, which, you know, is not completely. Foucault was not completely right.
I was, but he says, so, you know, it's like, so, I don't think they're completely. There's value in some of their thought, for sure.
Sure. So you raised the question specifically, though, of, you know, we enter into this new kind of information hierarchy, information universe, decentralized information, maybe, if we want, and then the question becomes, you know, you said, well, who's going to hierarchize the information for us, because we have to engage in the information through hierarchy. And I say, no, let's put our Michel Foucault post-structuralist hat on for a second and say, the question is not who is going to do this. The question is, how are we going to decide who gets to do this? Mm-hmm. Because what I'm saying is that the aristocracy that we've been in, the systems of, you went to college and you kissed the right butt and you went to the right cocktail party and you diddled the right person at Harvard or whatever it happens to be, and now you're the authority, or you're whatever the hell it is that Bill Gates apparently did, to where he can talk to us about literally everything and we all have to apparently listen to him. Or, you know, LeBron James, because he can throw a basketball, is somehow a friggin' expert in China policy or whatever, which happens to be paying his ginormous salary. You know, this system is corrupt as hell. This system like the Catholic Church before it, rose up to a point where laws of convenience and human corruption and whatever you want to add into it created it. It's now selling indulgences or selling carbon credits and all of this. The thing is totally bogus, and people are recognizing that it's bogus. So the question isn't who gets to decide how we prioritize information. It's how do we choose the people who get to decide. And so I come back to a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And so the solution that enabled a quarter millennium of success, or most of a quarter millennium of success, through the previous revolution was establishing the concept of a republic. Within this now free, we didn't go to a free, wild, hootin' tootin' democracy in 1776 or 1789, whichever year you want to pick, or the years in between those as they worked it out. 1789 is really, I guess, the relevant year. We didn't go to this like freewheeling like democracy. That would have been a disaster. The Greeks understood that a democracy is a disaster. I always like to make the Greek pun, and I don't think it's really a Greek pun, but demos like the public, and demos with an I in it, like panic, like the moon of Mars. You know, it's the same sound to the roots. They knew that a free democracy, they came up with this concept of a republic. What is a republic? Well, it is a means of choosing through, it turned out they used a democratic election method to choose, but it's a means of choosing the people to whom we're going to bestow that political authority for a time. And so the same kind of structure to let me put it this way. If we have moved into a parallel, or if we're moving into an information era that's in parallel to the political era that we moved into at the end of the 18th century, and the structure that worked for that solved the question of political legitimacy in that 18th century paradigm was whatever a republic or a democratic republic represents. We don't have that structure in the information era yet, but something like that probably works. So the question, where Foucault was quite perceptive then, is the question of who gets to decide what's true and false. What political process is used to decide truth and falsity becomes more relevant than or it's more interesting, he believed, than what is it that we regard as true and false. And is that which we regard as true actually true even? He says, no, it's what matters is the question of legitimacy and authority, which is a question of politics and how that person's decided. And so it looks like something more decentralized, whether it's through, crypto, which I totally understand that crypto is maybe going to work, and it might be the biggest mistake humanity's ever made, because central bank digital currencies are the one ring. It's right. The end. That is giving Sauron the one ring. That's right. If they pull those off, and then Minas Tirith falls, and many fair things definitely fade, and all of these different things. But I don't know how we enter, like we've had for 200 years, a expert designating process that's now viewed as illegitimate. Just like before that, within the church, there was an expert designating process that became viewed as illegitimate. And getting the answer to that question right is the path forward. And it has something to do, I think, with setting the logos as sovereign and not cutting its balls off with the rest of postmodern philosophy.
So let me throw a wrench into what you're saying. Well, not a wrench, but let me frame it in a different way, like maybe in a non-political way, because I also believe that the solution is not a political one. This is going to sound corny when I first say it, but please bear with me. So I think it has more to do with worship. Ultimately, that's the key. That is, it's about what is your highest value and what is, like you said, but it's not just something that goes on in your head. It has to be something that you practice. That is, worship is very important because it's about attention. It's about what is the thing that we give our highest attention to. And in the Christian sense, it's not just logos, by the way. It really is the notion of God is also beyond logos. Logos is the means by which the infinite manifests itself in the world, right? That the world was created by God through the Son, and that the Son is the means by which the world exists. But there's also a sense of infinite wonder and infinite mystery hiding behind the logos, and that
right, the vacant holy of holies.
Yes, exactly. This idea of like the divine darkness, the divine emptiness, or this something. This is that which is beyond that which can be named, or that which can be. Which, by the way, Derrida also kind of points to sometimes. He tries to kind of get to it in his later work. So for me, that's really the solution. So if you look at, let's say, in the Catholic Church, the way that it would work, and the Catholic Church would constantly get corrupted all the time. It's not like when the Reformation happened, it was the first time that the Catholic Church became absolutely corrupt. It was constantly getting absolutely corrupt. But because even though they were corrupt, they all recognized, at least in theory, what their highest value was, which was love, which was charity, love of neighbor, care for the poor, all these things. When they wouldn't do it, at some point it would lead to the demise through a saint, through a monastic figure that would appear, or a monastic order that would embody that, and that everybody would give their money to, like just rush to give all their money to the Franciscans, or to, depending on the time that it was happening. And then that order would also get corrupt, and then it would change. And so I think that, to me, that ultimately the mechanism, although I think it's important, it has to be rooted in worship. It has to be rooted in all of us recognizing what the highest goods are, actively recognizing that. I think one of the things that made the America function was that although they didn't say it explicitly, implicitly they were still writing Christian worldview. They were still kind of writing out the Christian worldview, and they didn't totally understand that. They didn't, let's say, they implicitly put it into their documents and their thinking. They didn't explicitly put it there. And as the Christian worldview ran out, as the Enlightenment plays itself out, then the steam by which the machine was working stopped working, and then the side effects of the system started to show themselves. People started to act in bad faith, because any system can be destroyed if approached in bad faith. Like, there is no perfect system,
Right.
That's why I'm so explicitly. It's not why, but it's one of the reasons you can understand why I'm so explicitly Christian, which is because I really do think that the solution to the political problem is worship, and it is like highest attention.
Your story of the Catholic Church was the story of the Old Testament there, right? It's the same story. So you have the Israelites, they make a compact with God. That's Abram becomes Abraham. And then one after another, they screw up. They fall away from God. They stop getting their spiritual priorities in order. A prophet arises and is like, hey, yokels, knuckleheads, come on. Your life sucks because you fell away. And then a renewal happens under the direction of the prophet. The prophet becomes a major Old Testament figure. And then here we go again. And then here we go again. And here we go again. And so,
just to go back to the definition of revolution, there's another sense.
James is trying to say he's a prophet. I'm not.
I'm definitely a prophet. And you are my evangelist.
Of my mom, or your mom. But I just wanted to tie that the aspect of renewal to revolution. There's a different content to a revolution that's actually about a renaissance or a renewal. That word, we can just take those two words and kind of separate that, so we can get to one word where we mean that there is a change. There are moments of change and crisis that happen, and there's a choice that's made, or a prophet arises, or a reorganization. That can be called a revolution, but not the same revolution that you're saying that's about the destruction of the hierarchy.
Because if you look at the way that the renewals happen in the Old Testament, it's a good example, which is that the renewals always manifest themselves as a return to the garden. And we often don't totally kind of understand it that way, but there's a sense in which Moses going up the mountain, going to the place where God will, walk with him, is him going back into the garden and now restoring the reality of the origin in a way that's adapted to the times in which they are. Right. And so you see the same thing with the reconstruction of the temple, where, there are these new books, that are found but those books are meant to be a renewal. Like, they're not meant to just to completely demolish what is there before and rebuild it from scratch, or to decry what was there before and replace it with a new thing. But it really is the sense that here is the mechanism by which we can return to the origin. And I think that, like you said, Benjamin, there's a difference between those two. And maybe, James, that's what you're trying to do in terms of saying, look, we have this origin of America, and you're American, and this origin we don't have anything else for which America can exist by. Like, this is what America has to exist by. It's its origin, it's its constitution, it's all of this. And so can we reawaken the light that's in there and then reapply it in a way that is adapted to the world now, instead of this, like you can see in a lot of the woke type stuff, where they really are trying to destroy it and to replace it with a kind of socialist utopia or something.
Well, yeah, it's like I see in America, believe it or not, because as an Americanist myself, it's going to sound like total heresy. America is largely irrelevant. The America is the fruit in a particular land of what was called the cause of liberty. And so the cause of liberty, if you read back in the works of this late 18th century and even the early 19th century, throughout most of the 18th century, actually, you read a lot of these people, the cause of liberty, the cause of liberty, the cause of liberty. And then the French Revolution, of course, because it threw in egalitarianism, screwed that right up. As liberty, fraternity, and we translate it as equality, but it's egalitarian, and so it's
equity. Is that what was going on?
It's closer to equity.
It's closer to equity. Yeah,
it's closer to equity. I'm not going to say it's
no
equity.
Wonder.
It's closer.
Not
to
exactly, but it is
different
closer in the way
concept.
they understood it. Yeah.
But yeah, so it's a little bit of both. It's like a mixture, and so it is the cause of liberty, the spirit of liberty, which I think is in fact what you see throughout the Bible, throughout this Judeo-Christian, if you will, framework, which is, why did we get kicked out of the garden in the first place? Because we were given free will, which is even higher of an order than our happiness or whatever else that, our perfected state in the garden. And what is the repeated renewal story of the Old Testament and the redemption of the New Testament telling us? And then what are even the epistles of Paul telling us repeatedly? It's that we have this choice, right? And when we choose badly, stuff's going to go really badly. And when we choose well, things can start going pretty good for a while until we get stupid and choose badly again. So you say this comes down to worship, and I don't think you're entirely wrong. But as far as America, there's the thing, not to drift too hard off of the divine, but there's a thing behind America that's like the holy of holies behind it, which is the cause of liberty, the spirit of liberty, the idea that human freedom, not human equity, is the highest calling of what it means to be human. And the way that you achieve that is not through making everybody equal and like Marx basically projecting, he's laying on his couch, pay me to write, pay me to do useless things, pay me for my vulnerable narcissism. And, what's wrong with you, Friedrich Engels, when your poor wife died, or not quite wife, almost wife, the woman you lived with in love for 20 years has died, and that sucks. Where's my money? Most of the letter. And so, it's not that. It's actually being able to venture, to have a bit of your own and to venture it in life and see what you're going to do with it. And so when you say worship, I don't disagree. But for me, worship is an orientation of humility. And again, like I said, we don't have within the Enlightenment, or if this is a second Enlightenment, we don't have a disposition built into that. It is a thing that's happening, an organizational shift in how we approach the world or understand the various components of the world or dimensions of life within the world. But there's not a disposition. And we have this choice between humility and arrogance. When you're humble, you're worshiping. When you're arrogant, you're deciding that, I know how to order this myself. I know how to put the order into place. And so when you say that the answer is in worship, I don't disagree.
Humility in the founding movement of America, because you said the spirit of liberty. That I totally agree with. I think that the spirit of liberty cannot function without being submitted to something like love or charity, because then you end up having hard hierarchies. Like, you have really hard hierarchies of skill and people in the dirt, like people who just end up in the dirt. And so there's a sense in which the spirit of humility, do you think that that's there in the American founding?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be, because you have literal aristocrats writing all men are created equal. And what makes them equal is that they were endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And so somehow, that imago Dei, you have a literal aristocrat, Thomas Jefferson, working with other literal aristocrats, writing that these poor, including the slaves, these poor, absolutely disenfranchised people who at this point in history don't have the right to vote, they don't have suffrage because they're not landholders, etc., are somehow still men. They're somehow still equals with us. And what makes us equal is that we have certain inalienable rights. In other words, that we have certain factors that contribute to our liberty as men. And so that humility and that charity is kind of built in there. I understand what you're saying about, the kind of Ayn Rand, brutal hierarchy, gulch kind of disaster.
It's even more than that, because the idea of inalienable rights, I mean, I don't want to mess with that, too much politically, but there's a sense in which even the idea of all these rights is Promethean in its structure, right? It's like, these are my rights that I have. Whereas it's in a more traditional Christian or even biblical world, you have a sense in which it's more about responsibilities, and so the prophet would come to the rich and say, it's your responsibility to take care of the poor, right? St. John Chrysostom said, the reason for the rich are the poor. There's the reason why the rich exist are for the poor. And so there's a sense in which it's actually, as you rise up in the hierarchy, it's your responsibility to give back down. That's how you act in the image of God. But with the situation of like these rights that we set up, I think the revolutionary tendency is already in that way of thinking, which is like, these are my rights. I can take them for myself. These are what are owed to me by reality itself, and I can stand here and let's say demand them. And so there is a revolutionary, and so it would be interesting to see the difference between the one who stands and says my right is equity, and the one who says my right is
generosity,
equality. Like what it is.
But it's there. It's there. Yeah. Right. It's like, what does this mean to say all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights? What does this mean? It means what they're saying is, you're not God. Who the hell are you to take my things? The rights aren't complicated. Life, liberty, and property. These aren't. You don't have a right to a higher education. You don't have a right to medical treatment. You don't have a right for somebody to pay your bills. You don't have a right to be happy even. You can only pursue happiness. Right? And so you don't get much. They're pretty basic rights, that you can't have your life taken from you, that you can't be imprisoned by somebody else, short of felonious behavior, and that you can't be deposed of your property, which might be very modest or might be very grand in any sense, because the humility is, who the hell are you and who the hell am I? Thomas Jefferson's the aristocrat writing the government. He could very easily have written, down with King George, I'm your king now, give me your stuff. But instead he said, no, who the hell am I? I can't take your stuff. You might only have a little, you might have a lot, and I can't take it from you. And I can't kill you to get your stuff, and I can't imprison you because I didn't like how you acted or said or what you believed in particular. It was all about freedom of belief with the foundation of America in particular. Mm-hmm. So that humility was every single one of us here in this new experiment for the cause of liberty that we'll call the American experiment is who the hell are you? And so the only thing that you can do is say, well, if something's taking these things from you, it's an act of God. It's something bigger than us. We as American citizens or as free people on this earth don't have the authority to take from somebody else their life, liberty, or property. We're not talking, like I said, we're not talking about the right to be able to go have a gender reassignment surgery because you felt like you wanted one when you were 14 years old. This is not a fundamental right that was being described in this situation. We're talking about life, liberty, and property, very fundamental things, which comes from that orientation of, and I will address what's missing because there is something missing here. And they were aware of this when they wrote it, and we have, I think, largely left and forgotten it. But there was an orientation of humility because it's none of us, as any human being, landowner or not, slave or free, has the authority to deprive one another of these things. And granted, with slavery, it was aspirational in 1776 or 1789 when they were writing these things. It was still aspirational, but that was there was actually explicitly the aspiration. And a lot of these guys were trying to figure out, how do we undo slavery without pissing off the Southerners without whom we can't pull this off. And so what's missing? They did assume, however, that people would have the kind of, and they've said that they assumed that the moral backbone that comes from individual people choosing to have some system of worship that gives them that backbone to understand the world in this kind of enlightened, if you will, mature way, has to be present. It has to be, in fact, maybe dominant, if not hegemonic. And so when you hear people cry out, "This is a Christian nation," and they make various, I think, largely tortured arguments for that fact, or that claim, not a fact, is that what they're appealing to is that moral backbone and that general disposition to kind of that Christian worship and Christian mindset and Christian orientation, and the idea, like you said, not just of the imago Dei, like I am as God, so I can be a creator and do as I want, but I am as God, therefore it's my responsibility to bestow upon that which is below me, without arrogance, without selfishness, etc. That was a general concept among most of the people, right? And so there was this idea that if the state isn't going to dictate your morality, which is really in large part what the First Amendment is about, if the state is not going to dictate your belief, your moral core, your system of worship, then it's incumbent upon you, and they maybe took this too much for granted, to find something that orients you toward a North Star worth having. And at the time, they could generally trust that the vast majority of them were either Christian or Christian-inspired deistic philosopher types.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they didn't foresee the possibility that freedom of religion would lead to, like just anything goes, basically,
right.
a new age hodgepodge of chaotic beliefs.
Or even the Marxist belief that society is in fact that which produces man, but society in turn is the product of man. And so that you have this kind of totally different ontology of humanity that then gets a telos of perfecting that, cobbled onto it, which is basically Marxism and as a theology in a nutshell. It's really that simple. He says, man creates society, and the social conditions of society are what shape and determine man. And so man creates society, creates man, creates society, in this kind of cycle, which is happening unconsciously until we come up with the wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus, and with scientific socialism. Then we see the purpose of humanity is actually to humanize man, humanize the world, humanize society, so that it all becomes kind of this Hegelian ideal in the material world. And they didn't foresee that religion arising and conquering and filling in where, maybe millions of people would believe that if I can imagine it, it's mine.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And so, I think that in a way it's funny, because I think we probably end up agreeing to a certain extent, because I would say that although I think there's some issues with the formulation, let's say, of the Constitution in terms of rights, I think it's not bad, because there is in a manner in which it's also not, like I said, it's not a democracy. It has non-democratic elements to it that provide stability. It does have an appeal to the people at the same time, and it has a fractal structure, which I think is probably one of the reasons why it was so successful for a very long time. That is that it functions at different levels of so like the president has authority at a certain level, and then his authority actually doesn't go all the way down the hierarchy into the common world. So you have levels, you have governors, you have different representatives that help make a kind of more fractal structure, which is usually the way that something is more resilient. And so there's definitely some genius in the but I think that it has to be recognize that it has to be grounded in something higher, that it has to be grounded in something which will transcend it, or else it becomes kind of what it is now. And so that's why
we're doing slightly better on the non-tyrannical front than Canada.
Oh my goodness.
You have to.
Yeah, how you doing? You're a Canuck, right? You doing
yeah,
okay?
Definitely. No, I've been kind of, I guess, pulled into politics in a way that I tend to avoid it explicitly. I talk about it tangentially, but now I really, because I saw this stuff. I saw the whole thing from the beginning. I was one of the conspiracy theorists that saw that all of this was going towards digital ID and digital currency, that it was all this massive push towards these types of structures. And so I was like, I'm not going to participate in this, which means that I'm not vaccinated, and has actually very little to do with the vaccine, and has everything to do with all the political armature that was being set up around it. And so
Yeah, that's my primary reasons, by the
exactly.
way. Is like, what the hell do these people want? No, this isn't happening.
Exactly. And so because of that, I can't travel right now. I can't cross the border. I can't take a plane. Can't leave my country, basically.
Yeah, I saw this thing the other day, speaking of that. So they've created this kind of non-material wall, right, to wall you in, right? And so I saw this statistic on Twitter the other day, and it said that however many fantastically large number of people have left Los Angeles in the past 12 months or whatever, and it was literally like an open question, like, how could this have happened? And it was, I just replied very simply, you instituted communism without building the wall first.
That's right.
But this is another point, though, is what we're seeing geopolitically. I hate that because it's not geopolitically. That means it's a different word. But what we're seeing politically is that the walls are in your phone. Mm-hmm. The walls are not, build the wall and Mexico is going to pay for it. They're walls in your phone. You can't buy a plane ticket, so your phone can't contain a boarding pass, or if you will, it's a little there's other ways around that, but you catch my drift. Yeah. And
I can't go into the airport. If I go to the airport, they will refuse me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so
it's like I would need to have, if I don't have, like you said, if I don't have my ID on this thing, then I can't go.
And so that's what we're going to increasingly see, is the walls will close in through the digital world. That's right. Which will feel weirdly artificial, but having been to China a number of times, it still works. It doesn't matter if it's artificial or not, it still works. You still can't get together in China. Your phone still alerts you if you're near people who have too much debt, and gives you a warning that if you spend too much time near somebody with too much debt, then these things will not be good for you or whatever. Your bank account sometimes doesn't work or doesn't allow you to buy certain things.
Yeah. But it's interesting. Like, I want to just give you an image, because I don't know if you probably haven't seen me talk about this, but in the book of Revelation, it's interesting the way in which this comes together. That is, there's this beast that comes out of the sea, and it's important to understand the beast that comes out of the sea. When we now have the story of communism, we understand what that means. Like, what is this monster that comes out of the sea to kind of devour? But then that beast ultimately leads to, there's steps, but it leads to an image of the beast which is intelligent, which speaks, and then that image of the beast which speaks masters the identity of all people, right? It creates a universal identity by which all things are completely centralized, and that you cannot exist in the world without being a vassal to this one identity, you could say. And so, it's fascinating to notice that these two things end up being related as they kind of play themselves out. These are the kind of extremes that I telling you about, in terms of, because you see that in the story, there's a whore too, right? There's this whore on this beast. That's basically our world that until 2020. It's basically been this massive clown world carnival that has been rolling and rolling and rolling. And then at some point, the beast kills the whore and then sets up this absolute tyranny, right? I feel like, the shift between Weimar and Nazi Germany is a shift of necessity. Like, I'm not saying that it would be good to become Nazis, but I mean is that it's the pendulum calls the other side. And so if you go too far in this kind of chaotic madness of insane identity, and then it leads to the tyranny. And so a way to understand it is to understand the Tower of Babel, not in terms of narrative, in terms of subsequent acts, but in terms of the two realities that exist together, right? The absolute fragmentation and the absolute unity and tyrannical system, they kind of play with each other and they create each other. And what we're seeing, weirdly enough, is that we're actually seeing the chaos. We're seeing the whore and the tyrant almost being the same. Like, the whore is becoming the tyrant. It's like the whore is all the imagery of the whore and these weird broken down identities and marginal beings and exceptions, and all of this is actually coalescing into becoming the system of absolute identity. It's like,
In Revelation, what is the resolution of that, or what is the resolution
The end of the world.
imagistically? Okay, so it just ends. It's just the Great
Yeah.
Reset, like
Okay,
but
no,
with fire
The
this time.
apocalypse, and then Christ
No,
comes and
But
establishes
then
the
the
kingdom.
end of the world, the last image after the end of the world is actually the real solution, which is the image of the heavenly Jerusalem is an image of a technical system which exists around the garden. So at the center of the New Jerusalem is the Garden of Eden. There's a tree of life and the water of life. And then around it is this technical society. And it says that the kings of all the nations render their crown to the New Jerusalem. So it also has a fractal structure, which is that all the nations can exist and they give their glory up into the highest thing. And that there's a balance between the system and the source of the system. Like there's a balance between even the technical part and the purpose and the garden that was there at the outset. So the last image in Revelation is actually an image of balance between these extremes that we've seen being playing through all through scripture and all through history, basically, where it kind of comes into this balance. I mean, I don't know exactly what that means. You know, I don't know how that happens, but at least it doesn't end. It ends well, let's say, in terms of finding that balance.
So, James, on a previous conversation, we spoke about the university, and you brought up this book. I can't remember the author. You could probably remember this author, but he spoke about how the universities are going to fail because there's no longer a theological department. There's no longer an axiology or somebody who, because there's no theology there, it's distributed, and then everybody starts to claim the centralized belief.
The title of that book, and I'm trying to get the author's name back to my recollection, is The Idea of the University. It's very famous mid-19th century Catholic.
Wow, mid-19th century.
And I'm trying to think of his name because
Prescient.
I'm trying to remember if I have two of his books. I know where one of them is, and it's not in this room. And I'm hoping
French?
the other one is in this room so I can see his name again. You know, it'd be really convenient if I happened to be on a computer where I was connected to the internet and could find out who the name of the author is. But since I'm not able to think of it, you know, it'd be really interesting if that was the case.
Well, I bring it up because Jonathan has a core to his axiology or the theology. And Jonathan, you put it in the word worship.
It's John
and there's
Henry
a lot.
Newman.
John Henry Newman is the author. So, Jonathan, you have you have worship, and we can unpack that, and we should unpack that. I'm sure that that's a great piece of work that you're working on to unpack that. And I'm wondering, James, you're aware that needs to be there. You're aware that there has to be something transcendent or something that has the flavor or the aesthetics of a theology that is transcendent, that has some sort of language that approaches the divine. So I'm wondering, are you working your way toward a word or a concept that can fill that place that we can translate into worship? Or
I'm really hesitant to name anything because that's something very large and very dangerous.
Or is it very
general.
personal?
And so, you know, when I outline actually a theology, I'm looking for a kind of meta-philosophy that marries all of these ideas and orients them toward a single kind of transcendent North Star, whether that's values, our understanding of what it means to know, epistemology, axiology, and ontology are the two things, but also a sociology, and then that these things are wedded together in a theology, then oriented toward some kind of a North Star. Our mutual friend, Mike Nana, used to refer to this, lacking a better term for it, and you know how, I mean, all love to Mike, but he uses awkward terms sometimes that are difficult to unpack, but he calls it the infinity point. And we had this really interesting conversation. I don't know if you know that I was a mathematician at one point, Jonathan, but I was formerly a mathematician. And so we had this really interesting conversation about this so-called infinity point. And again, we just come back to humility versus arrogance. And so I said, you know, well, this is just like in math. He said, you know, there's this, well, let me just say what he says the infinity point is, then we'll do the math part, because everybody loves math and wants to talk about math on a podcast.
Everybody all the time.
So, but no, it won't be difficult. It's very simple, actually. And so what he said, you know, is there's this idea that humans are pretty limited beings. And we look out at the world, and it's like, oh, I got that, I can do this. This is my sphere of influence if you want. And it gets bigger. It's however big it is. It gets pretty big if you're a dedicated worker, put a lot of things together, get a good vision of the world, gain a lot of understanding and experience, and so on. But at some point, you're like, beyond me, above my pay grade, right? And you have to just kick it out and say, yeah, that's how the universe works. That's infinity. That's God, whatever it happens to be. And so eventually it's a information processing problem for humans, and whether that's humans individually or even collectively or even over time, that at some point you just say, whoops, that's way beyond my capacity. And so it's the infinity point is what he was referring to it as, and that's where it just gets kicked out to God. And so it gets kicked out to the infinite. And I said, well, it's funny because that's exactly how the infinite works in mathematics. How would we designate, say, the set of natural numbers, which is infinite, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the counting numbers starting with 1. That set is called the natural numbers. And the way that we do that is we say 1, 2, 3, and then however many we want to list. We could list a trillion or a googolplex or whatever numbers. We could list 1, 2, and 3. We could just put 1 and then ... Right? And so we just put a 3 dots or ellipsis. And what that means is we're now kicking this out to the infinity point. What I said with Mike was this is a really fascinating little point. There's an old saying and joke among mathematicians that every number is smaller than most, which is a true statement. So the number of numbers, take the biggest number you want that you can think of, a googolplex, whatever you want, Graham's number, some huge number. If it's a trillion, let's use a trillion just because it sounds big and isn't that big. There's a trillion numbers smaller than a trillion. Right? How many numbers are bigger than a trillion? Infinity. So you have to actually count. You could count in trillions: 1 trillion, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, ... There's an infinite number of trillions, and so every number is smaller than most. Is kind of this saying. And so as it turns out, we could do this. Thousands. We all kind of know what 1,000 is. Million. We have a sense of a million. A billion. This is where some people start to break down. They don't know. And in fact, there's a disagreement across the ocean here. Formally in America and in Canada, a billion is 1,000 million. But in Britain, traditionally, now it's blurry, a billion was a million.
Yeah,
which we call a trillion.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then you get to quadrillion, and then you get to pentillion, and then you get to hextillion or something. Sextillion is for 7, octillion for 8, and it goes up and up and up and up, right? And well, it turns out eventually, not only do you run out of names for numbers, you run out of the capacity to name numbers. You cannot name numbers after a certain point, which is why when you get to really, really big numbers, like Graham's number, which turns out to be smaller than most, it would take us, if I remembered how to do it, most of an hour to explain what Graham's number even is. And most of the numbers between, say, a trillion and Graham's number don't have names. They cannot be named. There are not words to name them. And you get to the point eventually where you couldn't name all of the numbers anyway, because literally there aren't even enough atoms in the observable universe to where you could count each atom as a letter to write down the name of the number. And so you literally hit this problem where there's a infinity point, in a sense, where you can't even name numbers anymore. They don't mean anything anymore. And this is why there's these weird branches of mathematicians who deny infinity entirely as a mathematical object. They deny the axiom of infinity. And some of them are called finitists. And they just kind of vaguely say that numbers are indefinite, not that they're infinite. And so it's meaning they are without definition at some point, indefinite. And that you just... At some point, you just have to kick it out to infinity if you accept the axiom of infinity, which is, in a sense, like accepting a theological axiom of God. But it doesn't matter whether you're a finitist or an ultra finitist, is whatever the hell that means, I can't remember, or if you are somebody who accepts the axiom of infinity, that the natural number is an infinite set. At some point, everything's a mystery beyond your comprehension, and you actually have to just stop and say, okay, that's just how it is. And so there is this orientation, this is that humility that I keep kind of coming back to, where at some point you have to, or the worship, if you want, where you have to stop and say, there's something going on all up there. All the numbers that I know, all the ideas I know are the ripples on the surface of a very deep lake. And the current is all under the water. And so are all the big scary fish and Chulu, the beast coming out with a whore on its back, and every other thing is down in the depths. The Balrog is all down deep in the water. And so there are things way beyond my comprehension, both for good and bad. And we have to kick that out and again, humiliate ourselves. And I say that, I don't say humble, I say humiliate ourselves in front of that reality. And so I agree, but I don't have maybe the courage or the brashness to name that thing, to apply a name to it, And then I would say things like, well, obviously we can read the Christian scripture if you want, or if you're Jewish, you can read just that part of it, and the attendant other parts that the Christians don't recognize. You can read your scriptures and get a taste of this thing. But I don't want to get all into this, kind of weird dialectical, all the religions are just parts of one, transcendent religion.
To ground it down,
either.
I mean, Jonathan, you mentioned the word very early in this conversation about being embodied, practices and embodiment. And James, I know that you have a sword. So
I have a very large sword. That's correct.
So you're part of the sword cast, but
you're part of you're definitely part of you're more of a kshatriya than a Brahmin, I would say.
You better watch out then.
In your posture. But I like to say something about, like what you said in terms of, so I think it's important to understand that in more mystical Christianity, let's say I'm Orthodox, and in Orthodoxy, we really do have an understanding that God is the infinite itself. And so I like actually the word indefinite. That is, in the sense that all the natural numbers are indefinite in the sense that they are contained in the set of natural numbers. Or the set of natural numbers is above so it's actually like that for many things. Like most of all the things you can recognize as having being have an indefinite amount of aspects to them, and that they jump up into something which is beyond it, and this.
Yeah, let me actually, I don't want to lose your thought, but let me give you a clear definition of indefinite, which is that anything that you give as the definition misses something.
Yeah, well, that's not what you could say that. You could actually say that about the notion of infinite. That is that, at least in Orthodox theology, we say that God is beyond being, and that God is actually, all the names of God are not appropriate to God, and that all the ways in which that God is beyond all thought, all being, all capacity, all being and non-being. St. Maximus says that God is being and non-being. So it's like he just takes two categories that are that basically contain everything that don't seem to fit together and smashes them together. And you see that if you, like you said, you've studied Taoist thinking, you'll see that they take that kind of Cohen approach where they smash two categories together to kind of make you jump up. But so the sense is that you're right. God is, you don't want to name God in God's absolute, essence or whatever, but that nonetheless, that because God is the source of everything, and because God is the origin of all these other hierarchies that kind of lay themselves out, then we live through participating. And we live through participating. We live through worship. We live through worshiping that infinite God, and that has an actual embodied reality to it. It's not just something we do on Twitter or something that we do in our mind. That it implies community. It implies practicing certain moral practices. It even implies a certain posture towards reality, and disciplines, practices, prayers, all these things, so that this embodies us. Like, it makes the infinite land in your actual life. And that's how I think we end up gluing together more than whatever political tools we have. It's that common orientation which will make us come together. And it's not perfect. It's messy, and there's all these, if you know history, you know that the Christians fight with each other and the Muslims fight with each other and the Christians fight the Muslims and everything. Like, it's obviously a messy thing. It's not but I do think nonetheless that this kind of embodied worship is the way in which we can ground our being and end up in communion with others. And then the rest, like in terms of our political stances, they derive from that. I don't know if that makes sense to you. It might be pushing you a little farther.
No, I'm trying to make. I think I understand what you're saying, and so I'm trying to figure out a way to frame something intelligent to say in response to it, not necessarily to disagree with it, because I don't actually think we disagree as much as we might think, except maybe in the naming. I'm trying to figure out through the idea of worship, as a matter of fact, because I kept using the metaphor of a North Star, right? And so what that is what it's a unifying direction.
Yeah.
It's
You
a
have to
point
orient
for
yourself.
unifying to aligning people's focus or whatever. And so worship, can be individual, but it can also be this communal project. And in some sense, it's almost like what we're talking about by worship is getting people to fixate their gaze in the same direction and to be humble in the same way before the same thing, rather than pointing in all different directions and doing whatever. There's probably many intelligent things we could throw in here about kind of the Marxist perversion of this exact system as well. Where Marx.
It's what's important to understand is that in the system, because we talked about different infinites, it's important to understand that this is a fractal thing, and that's
right.
what one of the differences between the authoritarian and totalitarian gesture that we see in the 20th century and now again is that it's fractal. So we exist as a family by all being oriented together towards our unity as a family, right? That's our little North Star, and then we exist as a city by having all our orientation in the same direction, recognizing the name, the city, and the structures which embody it. So you have this fractal orienting that you mentioned, and that fractal orienting kind of these orientations build up on each other and then create a world in which you can actually live. In the authoritarian system, they understand that too, but they want one thing that binds us all, like want an end point. They want a point, like they want the state, or they want Stalin, or they want the leader, or they want one thing, and that in order for that to work, they have to break down all the intermediary structures. They have to destroy community. They have to destroy churches. They have to destroy all the intermediary points of attention in order to create one single thing that kind of tries to bind all of reality together. That's the Tower of Babel image as well.
Yeah. I hear you.
Yeah.
I think that you're not wrong in this. You're not wrong in this intuition that you have, that this fractal structure as you're framing it. And I'm picturing like the Sierpinski triangle as you're talking. Actually, as a matter of fact,
what that is that the triangle with triangles inside?
Yeah. It's a triangle with a triangle inside.
Exactly
with the triangles inside. Yeah, but you just take the bottom pieces off, so it looks like a hierarchy instead. All the bottoms of the triangle are deleted, so now it looks like a tree diagram. I think that's got a name too. It's probably Sierpinski's tree or something like that. It's named after a guy named Sierpinski, as it turns out. And so you are correct with the totalitarian impulse, and of course, this is also what Marx says in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of the right. Is this is a famous Opium of the Masses introduction. The religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature. It's the opium of the masses. But a couple paragraphs down, he says that religion is the false sun that man puts so that he orbits around it until he realizes that he orbits around the true sun of himself. And so you can easily see how that breaks down the entire hierarchy. You're not orienting yourself toward your family. You're not orienting yourself toward your network of friends or your community. You're not orienting yourself toward the city or broader community in which that's embedded. You're not orienting that toward maybe the state or nation. You're not orienting that toward. And I was just thinking while you were talking about it, it's something as somebody who's very active as atheist movement stuff a decade ago, and think back at how it used to bother me to see kind of state officials like give glory to God, and now it's like, no, they're saying there's something higher than me that I have to be. Yeah, and I'm like, wait, that's really comforting. Okay, it's not necessarily an endorsement of religion. It's I'm not king of the universe mentality that's sort of important here that I'm kind of appreciating at the moment. And so what you see then is everybody's orienting toward themselves. And so what's going to happen is some megalomaniac is going to come in and be able to decide he's the true North Star with the right philosophy that's going to dictate what North Stardom's, it might not even be a star. It's probably the dirt and we're all going to face. And so, I think you are, I really like your framing. I've got more, it's hard to respond to because it's kind of abstract in the moment, but I don't disagree with what you've put out whatsoever.
Yeah, but you can see how, that's why I use the word worship. It's attention. It's like you were right when you talked about this idea of the North Star, but it's an embodied attention which actually makes the world, actually it's even more than what I said. It actually makes pretty much everything exist. It's like all things that have multiplicity are bound through something like a North Star in order for them to exist, even objects and things in the world. But that scales up into us, and then we exist together as beings, because you're made of a bunch of stuff too. Like you're also made out of a bunch of multiplicity, but nonetheless, this multiplicity coalesces into one, but only to the extent that you also are bound to others in love, and that continues to build up. And that's that image that I said about the new heavenly Jerusalem, right? That's why there's this image of the kings render their crowns, their glory up into the new Jerusalem. That is, that they all exist as kingdoms, but they are able to understand that there's something that transcends them, and they give that up, and it keeps going up until it reaches, until it reaches God, basically.
So yeah, this is this opens in the question is what. So I think we're largely talking about the same thing in very different ways. And what does it look like in the 21st century, where we are all connected by our phones, where our nations mean something because we live there physically and depend upon physical reality to survive in them, but at the same time, our nations that we identify with are primarily digital bands of people who are in some sense like-minded, which transcends or crosses all borders. Yeah. And then we're kind of in this poisonous moment where literally folkish nationalist thought is being injected into identity categories, which has never worked out real well. It's almost like there's this attempt to hammer us into, oh, you're white, so you're black, so you're Hispanic, so this, that, and the other thing in each case. And, you should identify that. I even just saw a thing today somebody sent me. It was, even when you speak about somebody else, that you should, unless they've explicitly told you, opted out, you should put identity first. So I can't refer to, say, I met with the Congressman Byron Donalds the other day. I talked to him. I can't say, I talked to Byron Donalds. I have to say I talked to the black man, Byron Donalds. I have to put his identity first to recognize the importance of the identity. And so it's almost like I met with the Chinese national so-and-so. I met with the British so-and-so. It's this folkish nationalism is being hammered on us in this kind of most disgusting way. So this is a challenge we're up against. What does this fractal orientation, if we will, this kind of fractal hierarchy of worship look like in a world that is no longer that your community is necessarily the physical community that you're surrounded with by virtue of happening to have been born or moved to a certain locale, and even with family, you're born into your family, but you're living on your smartphone, which is connected to the world everywhere. Fun times with being married, sitting on opposite ends of the couch as we do, talking to our people in our phones, barely looking at each other.
I think that the solution to that is reorienting of attention. And I think that it is, I'm not saying that, we're trying, and this is something that we're trying to do here as well, which is to reconnect to our feet that are on the ground. And so it's not that we're going to necessarily completely not use the phone or decry the phone, but you go to church. That's why I tell people on my channel at times to go to church. And what I mean by go to church is physically go to places where people gather together.
I say the same thing. Real life is what happens when you get offline. And I've had this whole conversation yesterday about with my friend John Wood Jr., I'm supposed to say, black man, we have to identify. And so we were having a conversation yesterday, and we were talking about the difference between Zoom calls and conferences and getting together in person, and the difference in connection that it makes, and how a year and a half ago, when COVID finally let me go to my first conference, and I just sat there in the lobby of this hotel after I talked with several people who wandered off for other commitments at the conference, and I kind of got left with nothing to do for a minute, and I sat there and thought about it. It's like, this is magic.
Yeah,
I feel closer to these people in a different way than I would if we would have spent all this time by Zoom, where I'm just going to push the red button on my screen in a minute and we're all back in our own worlds. We had to travel together, so there's a commitment to getting there. We came together. We're physically present with one another. If I start to drift, you can slap me on the side of the head or the shoulder or wherever, get my attention, tap me on the shoulder, arm around me, so there are these attention-orienting things that bring that community together. So I agree, go to church, where church can be construed broadly or narrowly or both.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way that we've been trying to do it. And also, I mean, basically, I don't know if you know Rod Dreher. He wrote, so his kind of Benedict option and now his recent book has been a way of thinking, the way we're setting things up here. And so like the parish, but the online world is useful. So I can tell you what's happening around me right now. So my parish, basically, you have the situation where a bunch of people start going to an Orthodox church because they watch my videos online. Not just that, but partly that. So they end up in this parish, but then the people there want to have a more real community and more real encounter. And so we actually start working on that, creating alternative, even networks for food, alternative networks for, and understand that we have to be in the same place. We have to get together and eat together and sing together and do these things physically and work towards basically creating alternative, even alternative economic systems, like looking at the Mennonites as a kind of example of what's possible in terms of creating alternative systems in every sphere of reality, because without that, we're fried, like we are.
I totally agree.
And it has to happen pretty fast because things are going super fast.
Yeah, we've got to anchor ourselves onto the analog. In fact, the physical, in addition to figuring out how to make use of the digital, while dealing with the fact that these things are dopamine pumps above almost anything else, and that the law of convenience dictates it's just easier, and therefore, you have to go through all that trouble to go to a conference. You have to get on a plane. You have to stay in a hotel. You have to pack your bag. You have to go through trouble to drive to the church or even to walk to the church and to be at the church. And there's other things you could be doing, and it's at a certain time. If you want people to get together, turns out punctuality is not white supremacy culture. It's a thing that is required for people to get together
just
intentionally.
For people to get together,
yeah.
And there's the messiness of saying something in front of someone that you don't get on Twitter, that you don't get on Facebook. You say something standing in front of someone, and then you see the way they look at you, and you get it. You can sense. That's why you can understand why the online world creates such dysfunctional behavior, because
of course.
Usually the physical world is there to remind you that that joke was off key, like that was too much. That statement just came out of nowhere.
Right.
You get
Whereas
it
on
by
Twitter,
the
you
subtle.
just block them.
Exactly. On Twitter,
Like,
you just block them.
And this was a thing for me. So this is a spiritual moment. I was in a conversation publicly one time where it turned out to get kind of contentious across, and I had the urge. This was like a red warning siren that went off in my head when I realized it. To block them. I wish I could block this person, like push a button and they just disappear. I can't hear from them anymore. And I was like, holy shit, I have left the path of wisdom. I have to come back. And so I agree with you completely about this. And I also agree, if we don't do this fairly quickly, we're fried, because the architects of digital tyranny are well ahead of where people think they might be. They've been seeing these opportunities and gaming for them for a while.
Yeah, that's what it feels like. I mean, it's like we're late to the game in understanding how this has been building up towards, like the relationship between digital currency, metaverse, digital identity, all these things, all of a sudden these puzzles that are appearing in front of us. And you think, well, for these puzzle pieces to appear so close to each other at this moment, it's not like this hasn't been going on for a while. Like these pieces have been put into place for a while. So like you said, we have a disadvantage at the moment in terms of we need to catch up to make sure that we're not completely swallowed. But in Canada, for sure, it's not being in the United States at this moment is probably a good thing.
Yeah, it's almost like the closer to Florida you are. Florida is doing
Texas,
okay.
Or Tennessee or whatever, all these southern states. Like for sure, because I have a lot of friends there, and you can just see that they just don't understand. I think it'll reach there eventually, because it seems like it's so pernicious. And it's also, for example, like our digital ID program here. I mean, obviously, nobody voted on this. It's just happening. It's just happening as if this is so obvious. It's just happening through osmosis. And it's like, and so it's like we have a digital ID program here and in Ontario, and it's moving towards federal ID of some kind. And so it's just happening. And I think it's going to happen in the U.S. as well, but they'll just take longer with more resistance.
Yeah,
So
there's a
time
great
to
deal more
get ready.
resistance.
Yeah.
Not in California or New York, but virtually everywhere else.
Yeah.
Maybe not in Washington either. Sorry, Benjamin.
No, we're screwed. But it's
Yeah,
beautiful
you guys are
out
like
here.
pretty much a pit of hell with very nice scenery and
Very nice
pleasant
scenery.
weather.
Yeah, but don't you feel, James, that something though has kind of broken in the past 6 months, or maybe like 4 or 5 months?
Oh, definitely.
Where some things we're not allowed to talk about a few months ago, all of a sudden, now people are talking about World Economic Forum. Before you would even just say that, and you were immediately like banned, and you were
I know.
conspiracy theorist. All of a sudden, we can say it. We can talk about digital ID. We can talk about digital currency, and it's as if they can't hold it in anymore.
That's what you remember, Benjamin, when we had our conversation about the Second Enlightenment, and I did a podcast about it, and I said that it wouldn't be able to be contained, right? And so this is, I feel like, what's happening. This is why I'm actually optimistic, is I don't feel like they are going to be as able to contain it as they hope they are. But not to say that things are going to be smooth. In fact, they're probably going to be quite bumpy. But yeah, something is definitely broken. I feel sometimes like, we're in a fishbowl and we've punched through the glass and the water's pouring out a little bit now. I take a little credit with the World Economic Forum because, of course, I've been banging that drum for a little while. Other people have been as well. But I remember I called a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Mike O'Fallon, on the phone late last summer. It was still hot out. So I just remember the weather. It was still hot out. And I called him and I said, I'm so frustrated that nobody knows who Klaus Schwab is. And then I said, what we need, and he's like in his 50s, so he's a boomer, and had no idea what I was talking about. I was like, we need a Wojak meme of Klaus Schwab. And then, of course, I found one and started making these Wojak Klaus Schwab, eat the damn bugs, or whatever. I put these words. And so I made people are like, wow, have you seen these memes? They send them to me all the time, and I open my phone and show them where I made them. Hundreds of them, and just started flooding the zone. And I told Mike, I was like, people are going to see this and they're going to think it's just some funny Bond villain thing. And then one day they're going to realize this son of a bitch is real. And they're going to be like, wait, what? And that has happened. And so that I feel it's like that scene in Kingsman where they're all, I don't know if you've watched that film or not. I know you like to watch films, but they're in the training and they're in their dormitory and they flood it with water. And they're all like drinking out of the toilet, or breathing out of the toilet or whatever, and because the U-bend or whatever, and there's air, which gross. And so however the edgy different guy, the Iggsy character, swims over and punches through the glass, and the water pours out, and they all get out of it, realizing that they're being watched through a two-way mirror. And he punches through that, and I feel as though we have broken through on certain issues, that the dam not only is cracked and not only is leaking, but now like chunks of concrete are flying off in the flood of water that's coming through, and the whole thing is likely to fail soon. But if the water doesn't stop going,
that's good. It's good that you say the thing is going to fail. I mean, I think that's because now. Anyways,
I mean, it's the power of Babel.
I'm happy that you have. I'm not as optimistic as you. I maybe it's because I'm in Canada and the Liberals now. They basically cemented their power until 2025, and they're just going to plow on. Now they're saying 3 doses for federal employees. They're basically going to keep adding doses until they remove any political opposition in the deep state, and so it'll just be like, man.
This is the same conversation I had with Mr. Nana in Australia. I occasionally have this conversation with Americans, but actually, we're pretty rootin' tootin'. Like every one of us is Tom Cruise jumping in an F-14 like right now. And whatever that other movie, Iron Eagle, where it was the F-16 and there's like some 16-year-old kid just like flying a F-16 and blowing up like Iran or something like that. Like every one of us is that kind of, except for the white liberals who are eating the fruit the snake gave them right now and just so happy about it. They're like, yum, apples.
No, we are. I mean, like
Canada's screwed. We're going to come save you, but like we got to fix ourselves first. We got to clean our room so we can come set your world in order.
Save us from Justin, man. Yeah.
Well, this is the thing, though, is I'm highly convinced that if they can't get the United States, then their thing is going to fall apart. Yeah. Now, I'm not promising that your life in Canada is going to be a pleasant one. anytime soon. But if they can't get the United States, then their thing is going to break. If their thing breaks, the next step is going to be, if actual power shift occurs in the United States, for example, the next stage is going to be accountability. And people like Justin are going to get dragged before a world court. And the liberals having cemented their power to 2025 and forcing all this crap isn't going to mean crap if every one of them is going to, going to The Hague and being brought up on crimes against humanity, which is where an accountability phase will go. And I actually think this is part of the reason they're making such a desperate bid for totalitarian power right now, not just because they dream of it and covet it and always have as the types of people they are, but also because they know that the internet, through its information capacity and the schemes that they've been pulling with financial markets, et cetera, are all closing in on them. That they're going to be exposed not just to charlatans and frauds, which is one of their bigger fears, but also criminals. And it's a matter of look at the CCP, criminal organization, obviously completely clamped down on their people, and they're stuck. Look at the Soviet Union; it lasted 69 years, completely criminal organization running all of that territory and all of those people into the ground for literally, 70% of a century.
So we now have a little longer than we would wish it.
These are not ideal. This is a kind of stakes defining things that I remind myself of. It's not that we're going to have tyranny for a season if it comes. Yeah. It will be hard as hell to get rid of it if it can be got rid of. But I think if they can't get the United States, then the opening for proper trials that are of crimes against humanity flavor changes the game as far as, if you look just at local Canadian or Australian or whatever politics and you don't see a way out, the international way out comes if their program starts to falter and fall apart. And I don't think that they can do it if they can't get the United States, but they're going to be if they get like all of Canada and the other Five Eye nations, for example, and they don't get the United States, they're going to manufacture some damn crisis to try to invade the United States with global forces, et cetera, which that'll be hot and exciting.
I don't think anybody wants to invade the United States other than Mexicans looking for a job.
No, I think they do. Speaking of Mexicans looking for a job, the Democrats, I just read this online, total tangent, not our conversation, but I want to just make it broadcast on more places. So I'm going to say it just to speak my motivations and intentions. The Democrats they've explicitly bragged that they're going to create a permanent Democratic majority by basically importing a bunch of Mexicans and South Americans, Central Americans, who are going to be permanent Democratic voters. And I don't think that they understand that all it takes is Spanish language media explaining queer theory and what they're doing to the children, to the Latinos, and they're Republicans forever. They are whoever is not the Democrats for all of eternity. Yeah. And so handouts will not overcome. By the way, we're giving you we're giving you all this welfare, but we're stealing your children. That's not going to fly in Latino culture. So, whoever's listening, start putting those stories on Spanish language media as widely as possible. Just going to keep, because I put it on Twitter and only got like 60 likes. I'm like, dude, this is like the most important thing I've said this month. Pay attention.
Grand strategy, James. Some people don't pay attention to it.
That's okay. I told a bunch of congressmen and other people the same strategy in person, and also some Spanish language media people over the weekend.
Well, the thing about us, like where I am in Quebec, the thing about us is that the French Canadians, they move in a block. They just, for some reason, they just all decide they're going to vote for the same. They don't even tell each other. There was that one time where all the French Canadians decided to vote for NDP for some reason, and nobody had told each other they would. They just all decided, they just like this weird like hive mind. And so, and the French Canadians control Canadian politics. That's the secret, is that French Canadians control, for good or ill, they control Canadian politics. And so now, like, there's, for the first time in my life, there's a conservative party in Quebec. They have like 20% all of a sudden. They went from like 0.01% of voting intentions to like 20% in 6 months. It's insane. They don't have a party yet. They don't have any, like, they don't have people in the party and everything. I was actually like vice president of my local party for like 2 weeks because they just didn't have anybody there. And so it's like, if the French Canadians shift, then things could shift. But, man.
It's like the Latinos in Texas and Florida.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, if they were to bombard Spanish language in California, California could actually be in some trouble, as far as Arizona as well, on the American southern border. So, I don't know what you have to do to the Quebecois, but putting it in French isn't going to help.
I don't know. I'm a bit disillusioned with my own people, and it's something I need to heal. My own fractal attention structure is something that I need to deal with myself.
No, I hear you, because I'm very frustrated with the Canucks right now.
Yeah, with reason.
And I'm from very close to there, by the way. Originally, I'm from the border of New York.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'm actually of similar blood, but I don't think we're French. Well, my dad took me to Canada the first time. We were in Quebec, and we went to a McDonald's of all places because I was a kid, and I had to eat something I recognized. And also, it was like the 80s or something, so it was like what it is. And so they, ordered in French, and my dad spoke enough French to do it. And then he turned to me, he said, "Do you know what they said?" And I said, "No." And he said, "They said, 'Eat this and die, American pig.'" And that's stuck with me my entire life. That's what I think of it.
You've had a secret animosity towards French Canadians because of that one lie.
Because my dad's a practical joker, yeah. I think he really said, pull around to the window. But
yeah. That's hilarious.
So, James, you have Race Marxism out. That came out, 3 weeks ago? Pretty recently.
It came out February 15th. So it's April 5th now. So
2 months
month and a half.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's been a while. How's that doing?
Good.
Yeah. And Jonathan, has your the first episode of your comic dropped recently? Or?
I mean, it's still printing, but I put out the PDF for the people that were supporting us on Indiegogo, and so that's kind of happening right now. So that's cool.
God's dog.
God's dog, yeah.
Yeah. And James, you run New Discourses, which is a plethora of it's a huge media empire, at least a fief you got going on there.
I've got a fiefdom. I have a solid fiefdom going on. I started a new podcast, a third podcast product.
What's it called?
I've got 3 now. It is called New Discourses Bullets. It's so American. I've got actually a hollow point with the New Discourses logo as the image. And then it puts the title in bullet points so you can see the pun with your own eyes.
And that's James shorts.
They are shorts. They're meant to be 8 to 12 minutes, with 10 as kind of the ideal, and digestible for policymakers. I spent the week in the Oklahoma State House talking with senators and congressmen and the cabinet and the governor and all of these things in Oklahoma, and they made it pretty clear that having concise kind of little things that they can digest in 10 minutes rather than an hour and a half would be very helpful. And so I said, okay, I'll try to see what I can do. And I started to realize that the public talks I give kind of come, as comedians would say, in bits. And so I could just take these bits that I string together and then, put transitions between them in a talk. I can actually just do those bits as kind of concise bullet point type discussions. And so the point is really to make them quick, to make them shareable, but also to make them useful to busy people like executives and lawmakers and so on. And so the first one of those came out day before yesterday, and it's about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's really funny because it's kind of, they're all the same. Here's this idea. It means Marxism. There's all of them in one sentence. I don't need the social justice encyclopedia I was writing anymore, because it's, pick your favorite word. What does it mean? It means Marxism. That's what it means. They all mean Marxism. Democracy means a state where everybody's equal and then they vote. In other words, Marxism with voting. And they all mean the same damn thing. But anyway, I've got the new podcast product happening now, and it's exciting.
Anyways, I just wanted to say thanks for what you're doing, James, because I don't think there's anybody else doing. Is there someone else doing what you're doing that is?
No, it's frustrating, because I wish there was, because I would put them on queer theory so that somebody do what I do with queer theory. So I don't have time to do queer theory, because I'm bogged down in education theory, because my friend Peter Boghossian said he was going to do it and then didn't, and nobody did it. And so now I have to do it, because I'm I was reading their education books, and I was like, I can't understand this until I go read Marx. I can't actually even understand what I'm reading until I go see. And now it's like, oh crap, all I did was repackage Marx. And then I look at now this culturally responsive teaching, I'm like, oh, they just repackaged Paulo Freire. It's just a repackage. It's literally, these people are not creative. I'm like, oh my God, it's literally the same thing. And so now, like, I'm doing Freire on the one hand and then switching over to racial literacy on the other. And then, like, by the way, Freire's thing was political literacy. Now this is racial literacy. Derp, can you see it? And, but no, nobody else is doing it. And I wish there were. I need, like, there are like 12 domains this is happening in. I need like 11 more of me.
Yeah, but I think it's because the way that the texts are written is so difficult to pierce.
I even have to I'm geared up and I have to read them 5 times before I understand what I'm reading. No kidding. So I told somebody yesterday it's a 10-to-1 ratio, like time ratio. I have to read the book 5 times and it's hard. So you have to read it slow to really get a hold of what's being said. Because it's funny how they're calling everybody about dog whistles. All they write is dog whistles. Everything is a code. It's all coded.
Yeah, but it seems part of the strategy also to obfuscate in that way. And you can see it because, I mean, you've seen it with what you're doing with CRT, which is that they just tell you it doesn't exist.
Yeah,
just say it doesn't exist, and then continue to do it, and then say no, we're not. What you're saying we're not doing, and then they turn around and they say, okay, let's do this, and they even say it loud. We're doing this, and then when you say they're doing it, they're like, no, we're not doing that. But we're doing
eventually,
this. Oh no, we're not doing that. It's crazy.
And then eventually they hold it up and they're like, yeah, got me red-handed, but we've always been doing it, and it's necessary to do it more. And it was
the
already
same strategy is applied to the whole COVID stuff, which is, you're saying, look at this is being weaponized and moved towards digital identity, digital currency, and then they say, no, you're a conspiracy theorist, and so here's our digital identity program. They can say it like one breath from the other, and people still think you're a conspiracy theorist for saying it. It's like let's say that 1984 doublethink is in full action, it makes your work a lot harder because you have to break through the doublethink before you can even convince people that this is happening, and it's like deprogramming people.
Yeah, my favorite example that I came across recently, just to point it out, is in the Freire's book, The Politics of Education. He's like, people who call themselves educators now actually have a messiah complex, that they're going to save people from being uneducated. And I'm like, dude, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You're trying to save people from the existing system. That's literally the definition of a messiah. Like, you're projecting it. Oh my God. It's within the, like, no. Everybody else is doing that. We don't do that. Yeah. By the way, here's my permanent prophetic vision for education and society.
Have there been any hardcore Marxist thinkers or postmodernists that have made a turn or kind of reformed themselves later on in life and said, you know what, this isn't
Thomas Sowell famously said he started out Marxist and became a conservative, and then he got asked why, and he said, well, facts. So
but that was early in his career. I'm wondering if anybody had a deathbed conversion.
I don't. Okay. It's really interesting, and this is probably a huge weakness in my work. I'm not interested in people, like the characters. I don't care. Yeah. I read their ideas. They're almost, unfortunately, disembodied. Occasionally I start, like with Marx now, I read a biography or two of Marx and I'm like, oh, well, I see what he's about. And then with Foucault, it's like, well, the dude wanted to diddle kids. Like just what he wanted to engage in hardcore BDSM gay sex, which whatever, more power to him. With kids, okay, not more power to him. And like so much of his philosophy derives from that. Marx wanted people to pay his way while he diddled around with philosophy. Okay, like, I got you. All he wanted to do is write worthless crap. And famously, like, his mother was like, Carl is so great at talking about capital, maybe he should earn some, or something like that. So sometimes it becomes interesting, but I don't know. I don't track them like that. Deathbed seems like a weird time that you would give up on communism. There's not really an incentive there at your deathbed to say, whoa, I was wrong about this. But, when your life sucks and then you realize that taking responsibility for it can help you climb out of that, then you have that moment. Or like with Manning Johnson, very famously, when he realized that the communists were using him to create a black vanguard. And he was like, wait a minute, this is just a plantation under Eastern Bloc language or whatever. And he got out and became anti-communist. When you do that, disillusionment it seems like it could come at the end of life, like deathbed conversion, but it seems to come, from what I've seen with different examples earlier.
Yeah,
than that.
A lot of people get strung in by like the idealism of the communism, but most people I know, by the time they're like 25, 26, if they're gonna wake up, they wake up like in their 20s, and then they're like, no, this is crazy. But a lot of people are seduced by communist ideas when they're like 19, 20, 21. It seems like that's a lot of people that happens to them. But
I had this funny story last weekend when I was in Miami. I went out to grab some dinner. I had a friend that can vouch for this with me, and we went out to grab some dinner, and these activists were on the street corner, and the guy comes up to me and was like, "Hey, would you like to help save the world?" And I was like, you probably don't hear this very often, but I'm a little busy saving the world already, and I mean that. And so
you're lucky he didn't recognize you as.
Yeah, I know. And so we get having this conversation, and I'm like, well, what do you do? And it's like, well, he's talking about all the forests being cut down. He's got some environmental thing going on. So he's like an enviro-communist. And he's talking about, he's like, well, how are you saving the world? And I'm like, well, I don't know about that, but I talk about Marxism, and this is, I'm talking about, what's going on in the world today is Marxism. And he's like, well, Marxism is actually good. And so then it kind of progresses in that regard, and we start having the conversation. He's like, what do you see as wrong with Marxism? And I kind of blow his mind a little bit, because it's like, I actually know it, and he didn't think that was going to happen. And so then I'm like, okay, so all this is a bit fun and abstract, but also I want to go to dinner, and I don't really want to keep doing this all night. So let me just cut to a chase. You're talking about the rainforest in Brazil and around the world, and saving the trees, and how many football fields worth or square miles worth or whatever of forest are being cut down every 10 minutes. What are you doing on a street corner in Miami, in one of the richest neighborhoods in Miami, to solve that problem? And he was like, oh, we buy the land. And then when the land is bought, then they can't cut down the trees on it because it's protected. And so we just buy the land and turn it into a conservancy. And he was like, and he caught himself. He's like, oh, so we're really using capitalism against itself. And I was like, why don't you just say that you're using capitalism to achieve a goal in the world? Because that's actually what you're doing. And the capitalism, in other words, the securing of private property rights, is what's saving the trees. It is the fact that you are acquiring the capital, and there's a securing of property rights that means that people can't come and cut down those trees and plant, a farm for 2 years, that the soil will be then destroyed or whatever. So the capitalism is actually what's enabling you to save the forest. Why don't you put it that way instead of this crap about how you're using capitalism against itself? And he just kind of like, it was like that, like Men in Black, because he's like, I guess we kind of are. And then I was like, okay, so now I'm going to ask you a more practical question. What's good to eat in this neighborhood? And then we had a great, after that, it was really weird. The politics vanished, and like they all turned so nice. It was like super, like kind of confrontational, but not antagonistic. And it was like, now we're friends. Oh, I love this restaurant. Oh, this one. There's all these people crowded around their whole little group. It wasn't just me and the guy kind of verbally sparring. All the other ones like come over, and we're all like hugs and handshakes. And it's like, that sushi place over there is really good. And it's like, wow, look at that. Food and neighborhood, et cetera, have brought us together immediately. Yeah. Wow. It's kind of a neat experience, but I don't know exactly what the point of that was, but we had a conversion.
No, but I think it's a good point. It's a good point also in that real encounters and that actual, encounters with people are different from the abstractions that communism engages with, the kind of weird abstract notions of classes and the weird abstract notion of how these systems are going to be put into place. This people excited about their own community and excited about fixing things where they are. That's the real thing.
That's part of why my favorite piece of art regarding communism, I think, is this political cartoon of the jackboot coming down about to stomp on somebody, and it says socialism or communism or whatever on the boot, and it shows some young idealistic artist painting like a sunny day picture on the bottom of the boot. And it's like, yep. And of course, this guy was like probably in his early 20s or mid 20s. He was a really young guy, very idealistic. Yeah. We're going to overthrow the capitalist system because then nobody will cut down trees. Because that's exactly how, like, have you read for like 5 minutes about the things that Mao did when communism came to China? Like,
I mean, industrialization was brought about in Russia by the communists, not by.
Mao had they killed all the birds just because, like, they weren't Chinese enough or something. It's this dumbest story. If you don't know about Mao and the birds, it's literally one of the dumbest stories. Caused a famine because he killed so many birds that there was, the locusts were there next year to eat all the crops because the birds weren't eating the bugs. And it's just a total calamity. And you're going to invoke socialism as, the environmental solution to the world. Are you kidding me? Have you seen what these people do? They're out of control.
Yeah, definitely.
Have you seen Chernobyl? Do you think that was an environmental success? Because that was caused by not being willing to talk up the chain under a authoritarian system where you're going to now get your head cut off or shot because you screwed up in a small way. And, whoops, I pushed the button too long and the thing got too hot. Oh, don't tell anybody. Ivan might have done it. I didn't do it. And the next thing you know, we're 50 years out or whatever, and the place is still a catastrophe.
Exactly. Guys, I need to go. We've been going for a while. It's been
welcome to a James and Benjamin video. This one's short for us.
Super long conversation, but it was really great. I really enjoyed it. We could maybe organize something again sometimes. That'd be fun.
That'd be fun for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for joining, and thanks for proposing this, Jonathan. And
it was great.
To have a
and
rationalist and a symbologist kind of collide, come together, and watch you guys make sense of each other. It's pretty.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's interesting for me. It'll be interesting for me to think about the places where we connect and the places where we don't, and to kind of reflect on that and see how I can think about it and then formulate my ideas also in that context. So. It was great.
Yeah. Well, cheers, gentlemen.
All right.
Yeah. Have a
Bye,
good
everybody.
day.